So we have a new episode of Legends and Leaders, and today it's great to have Yat here. You're somebody that has tried to be early on and a pioneer in so many different areas. First, with being early on in free web pages and email providing in Asia, and helping bring and make that mainstream in a different part of the world that it wasn't beforehand. Then you went out and decided we need to really have white label hosting for web devices and different services and have it be secure and be multilingual. And with Outblaze, you led the wave and you built out a user base of over 70 million people with that. Now you're on the Hong Kong government task force for Web3 with Animoca Brands. You've been chairman there, trying to be instrumental in investing, been one of the most prominent investors in the space. So I'm excited to have you here, Yad, and to get into your story.
Thank you for having me. Great.
Awesome. So where did your passion for business and technology come from? Was it something that you had as a kid? Like, how did this kind of evolve into, hey, I want to go and create something in the space?
So I grew up in Austria, in Vienna, to a family of musicians, and I actually studied music originally, just because my mom in particular thought that'd be a good path. Classic sort of, I guess, immigrant story, not the music part, but I know this, so therefore you should do this too. So I studied music in Vienna, which had nothing to do with business, and I actually grew in a surprisingly unbusiness-like environment, if you think about it, right? So I wasn't exposed to that really. My father was he quickly recognized that the arts wasn't a place to make much money. So he did become a businessman. And although I was never involved in any of it as a kid, and my parents split when I was young, but I did see him build a modest business empire in Vienna as an immigrant. So that was interesting, although I didn't really fully quite appreciate what it was. And I also saw it collapse, right?
Mm.
So that wave in itself was an interesting experience, and the consequences thereafter that sort of actually in some ways engulfed our entire family, and obviously, actually my mom and to some extent I had to sort of deal with the aftermath of that,
Mm.
even though we weren't really involved, right? So if anything, one could say that would have probably turned us off on business. And also remember Europe at the time, and maybe even today, wasn't the most sort of business-friendly kind of place. Right? And it's not just taxes, it's environments, it's attitudes to risks, all that kind of stuff. The way I kind of got into it was, I started writing sort of MIDI software on the Atari, and I shared that code on an early pre-internet service called CompuServe. And then, people just started sending me money. And I didn't really have a bank account at that time. So that was kind of my first
Huh.
introduction. Oh, you know what? There's something there. But again, it didn't come from the lens of, okay, this is a business, because I didn't know what that meant. It was just more like, oh, there's money, and I could use that. And then Atari basically sort of said, oh, we like the software you wrote. And again, they discovered it on CompuServe. Like, would you like to come in? And I was a kid, and they said, oh, okay. I guess you still want the job, basically. And I started working for them when I was technically still a minor. So this sort of one thing happened at another, and I kind of just let sort of serendipity flow in terms of the areas that interested me. And maybe if I was to say one thing, business aside, I just kind of went with the flow as to what I felt was right. I didn't have a
Mm.
plan. I know people who have like a 10-year plan, a 20-year plan, how much money they would need to make by that point, and like that they have a family and that they must have a house, and that's a. I never lived life that way, and maybe because my early life as a child was turbulent, as in I didn't have stability. My mom was
Mm.
working actually in parts of her life in East Germany, which is anything but stable, right? And I would go
Huh.
visit her, and I lived alone for most of the time as a child because my mom is a single parent. Plus,
Mm.
in the arts business, originally as a singer and then opera director, she was touring the whole time. So I was actually living alone as a minor for a large part of my life, which again, today is unthinkable, but back then was kind of normal. So maybe the skills that I learned was, a sense of independence, a sense of sort of just go sort of survival almost, although it'd be unfair to say that I was like scraping for food or something, right? But I would like generally just surviving on your own, and sort of I had friends of course in Austria, and just sort of going with what felt right and having sort of run with instincts, as it were. And so it led to one thing to another. So my real sort of business beginnings was when I was in the US, because Atari had brought me there, and Atari went under. And so a bunch
Mm.
of us started a business to support Atari, Atari stranded owners. And this business, eventually, basically, I became I guess, co-owner of that business. Because there was just a few of us. I didn't quite know what that meant, so we were supposed to have received shares and whatever, but we just worked, and we ended up getting paid for that, and it was actually doing quite well. And then we pivoted to SGI, basically writing OpenGL modelers, really in what was back then called VRML tools, virtual reality markup language, which is essentially the VR version of HTML. Didn't really take off for good reasons because it was primitive, but it was kind of a vision of that future. We're talking now maybe like early 90s, like 92, 92, 93 type of time frame. And that business got acquired. And that's probably my first sort of experience of truly getting screwed in business, in the sense that,
Oh no.
like the business was sold and none of us really knew who got what, or at least some maybe did. Certainly I didn't. And and the next thing I know, I was basically seconded to SGI. I was like, oh, okay, what just happened here? And from what I understood, basically, whatever the acquisition was, I never really ended up getting anything that was meaningful. But because of that experience, I was sent to Asia, and I worked in Japan, and I worked in Taiwan, and then I came to Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, I couldn't get email, and email was very good to me in the early days. And I couldn't get a CompuServe node either. So I set up one of Hong Kong's very first internet service providers. This was before CyberCity, the one that you were describing, called Hong Kong Online. And with that, essentially started my true, I guess, independent entrepreneurial career in Hong Kong. And I remember the first servers that I set up were actually Next computers and a bunch of BSD, free BSD servers that I had set up. Those were the early days. So it was kind of serendipitous. I didn't have a business degree. I learned about business. I had to learn about cash flow. I brought in friends over. It was very difficult. But I guess I would say I was mostly I was generally self-taught in that area. And then as time went on, I had, hired people smarter at things that I wasn't good at, whether it was accounting, whether it was business, whether it was just associates. And over time, I just ended up absorbing various sort of skills and so forth to where it is today. So, the accumulation and also the way in which Animoca Brands is built today is kind of a history of sort of my own personal experiences, my own personal philosophies and viewpoints that I had experienced really from a child up until today. And I've been around the block. So yeah, relatively speaking.
So with Outplays, you decided that you're going to sell the managing assets of it to IBM. And I know like why it was important for them, but at that point, like why did you think that they were the ideal partner? I mean, was it just that the offer was too good, or it was a great offer? Like why did you feel like they were ideal, and what was it like for you after selling it?
So, the Outplays experience was first, the way Outplays started was when I started CyberCity as a free web page provider. I didn't have the capital, and there was no venture capital in Hong Kong, Asia for that matter, right? I think SoftBank hadn't even started yet. So anyway, there wasn't any VC funding available for crazy little businesses like us in Asia. And so I just couldn't see how I could compete with like GeoCities and so on, which was basically the sort of the major web page provider at the time. So, it made more sense after we got acquired by Zap so that was when CyberCity, or Free Nation as it was called, was acquired. With some of that capital, started Outplays as a way to, no, we still believe in the internet, but maybe we should be the picks and shovels for this wave of the internet. I still wanted to be in the business. How could I make an impact? Make another website? Not sure, all that kind of stuff. And then we were software developers, and we had sort of builder backgrounds. So we basically built, tools that allowed people to create, websites and email and all the services I had actually previously built at CyberCity for a consumer business into a B2B business. And as time went on, email became the biggest part of the business. And the business really started to grow when the .com crash happened, because we built everything on Linux, because I didn't have much money. And if those who might remember, in the late 90s, nobody was using Linux. Everyone was using, Sun Microsystems, right? And to some degree, Microsoft. Because if you're building a serious, like an internet business, then, you can't use open source stuff. I mean, those parallels are obviously all dead, but, we come to very similar conversations today in terms of you can't use community built stuff. You got to use essentially professionally built stuff. And of course, that's all out the window. But that gave us a real competitive advantage, particularly for pricing. And the office I set it up was right next to the computer center in Hong Kong, so that when we needed spare parts, we could literally go there and buy a hard drive or so, plug it back in. That was essentially our hot swapping interface, right? we didn't have, I couldn't afford to put an inventory of drives or inventory of servers. So the next best thing was to put your office literally 5 minutes away from where everyone was buying this stuff in one chai. And so that's kind of how that set up. And that business grew to where it was today. And I remember like late nights we would like have outages and we'd like literally carry ferry wheel servers on. I mean, back in those days. When when IBM basically was looking to acquire us, it started around 2007, 2008. I don't quite remember. And everything in IBM takes a while because when they want to buy something, it's not like they just like, oh, let's go, let's do something quickly. That's not how they operate. And I remember the number of people that ended up doing due diligence on us for the acquisition was between 150 to 200 people, which is
Wow.
roughly the number of people that I had in all of our place. So and because it's such a large organization, it was a harrowing experience. It was akin to, I guess, a corporate colonoscopy, but it was very, very interesting to see how sort of operation acquires a company like ours. I learned a lot in that process, but also what happens afterwards in terms of, like for instance, IBM doesn't like to buy companies with the entrepreneur because I
Mm,
guess we're disruptors and we kind of cause chaos. And whatever it is that we do, the IBM antibody will eventually eject us. So may as well not introduce us. So it was actually quite fascinating. So my role was to transition, but was never to be there. And that actually was
wow.
really interesting because when your mental mindset is a little bit like, oh, I'm acquired and I should work here. It was very different. It was more like, we're going to acquire you and then you're out of a job, right? And I mean, financially that was okay, but mentally it kind of sets you up for a different path, right? You're like, okay, well, if I'm not working here and I don't have a duty almost, right, to work here, right, which is kind of more my mindset. It's like, okay, if you acquire our business and I have a duty to help out and whatever, but it was more like a release of that. It was like, you go ahead and do whatever you want to do. That kind of sort of set us up for what eventually became Animoca. And we had an entertainment style business sort of left over that IBM didn't want in the sort of the early sort of
Uh,
non-mobile gaming space. And so we transitioned that essentially ultimately into mobile gaming. There's another story, but we just don't have time for that probably. But anyway, the acquisition happened in part because the market was consolidating. We were competing, with Gmail and Microsoft, well, Google in this case. And it was either, we go and try to actually raise, significant amounts of funding to compete, or maybe we could be part of something bigger. And IBM needed a solution too, because they were getting squeezed out with Lotus Notes on that area. And
mm,
so it was kind of a match made, a perfect match. And also we were the only ones left. So there was a time when we had a lot of companies competing in our space, like companies like ComTouch and Critical Path and a whole bunch of, sort of companies providing these type of third-party email services and web hosting services. And as time went on, partially because we were in Linux and the competitive advantage, they all sort of got outcompeted either by the big platforms, being Google, or essentially by the fact that they, it was no longer price competitive. So we were kind of almost the last man standing. And so,
mm.
in terms of M&A options, we didn't have, it wasn't like we were looking, right? It wasn't like we had like a whole slew of suitors saying, oh, we'd like to buy your business. I was literally, IBM was like, okay, which companies could we acquire? Oh, there's only one. All right, fine, let's have a chat. And so that took a really, really long time. But in effect, I would say, we didn't, I would say we didn't really have a choice unless we had a pathway to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. Sometimes I fantasize a lot about this thought that because we had messaging infrastructure, and we knew everything about it, that, with the advent of mobile, we had everything that could have built the next WhatsApp
Huh.
back, because this was back 2008, 2009. But so the one thing that also happens when you get acquired, you have a non-compete. And
Mm,
so I was not allowed to build anything around messaging or enterprise technology for the next 3 years. So between 2009 and 2000, essentially 12/13, we couldn't actually enter the space in which I had built expertise on for the decades previously, in a sense. So who knows? Like, and then when you saw things like, sort of, like Viber and Line and sort of
mhm.
WeChat, they all emerged during exactly that time, right? There's a little bit that goes, oh, maybe we could have done that, right? But who knows, right? I don't have regrets. It's more because if I did that, then I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today. But it was more like an interesting sort of anecdotal thought in terms of if this path wouldn't have happened, we wouldn't have been probably able to survive staying in the classical sense of messaging. So because it would have been just too competitive. So we would have to pivot, right? And sort of going to mobile messaging seemed like the most obvious path.
Mhm. So why did you decide to get into Web3, and like why are digital property rights so important to you?
So I think fundamental is that we got into it first with CryptoKitties. Our studio in Vancouver called Fuel Powered ended up having a hand in helping shape it, and its co-founder ended up becoming essentially one of the co-founders of what became Dapper Labs, and we became investors in the space. And really, what fascinated us was the fact that we can truly own actually those digital game items, and that's kind
Mm,
of a at least from the way I grew up, sort of a gamer's wet dream to actually be able to own your digital assets and sort of own the provenance and do stuff with it, which we couldn't do. I mean, I bought my first virtual item. I think it was a virtual sword from a multi-user dungeon, which is like a text-based mobile, it's a text-based web-based sort of
mm,
game called Perilous Realms. I think it was like in 91, 92. I don't remember, right? And these the way that we traded them and the fact that for like in existing games it's not allowed was kind of ludicrous to us. So we ended up sort of really sort of deep diving into the space. And then that's really when we started to fully understand the potential of blockchain in being able to actually give us digital property rights.
mm,
And the concept on property rights is the same as it is for the physical world in the sense that when you have property rights, you can have capital formation and you have businesses compose on top of these
oh,
experiences. So, for instance, the fact that you can own your car is the reason that you're able to, have Uber and Lyft and people making tires and, music services for your car or like, sell you sort of, leather seats. That stuff is only possible because you own the car and someone else outside wants to offer you a service. And it doesn't need an intermediary to say whether you're allowed to do so. And so what happened in Web 2 was that in the digital space, we started getting all these intermediaries that ended up taxing the ability to actually do business with each other for simply the right to be there. This, by the way, wasn't the early promise of the internet, right? The Web 1.0, as it often is described, was actually very decentralized. I had a website, you come to me, you do commerce, you work with me directly. Like we figure it out. You want my information, you go to my website. We share value, we share data, we do all that kind of stuff. But in Web 2, we actually had to do this through Apple or through Facebook or through Google or whatever mechanism it was. We ended up going through intermediary. And in time, they started taxing that, taxing that role. And then they started monopolizing that role, right? I mean, if you remember, Facebook didn't start off charging people essentially fees for using their APIs. They just said, come on in, just come in and we'll give you access. Then all the network value and the network effects started to accrue inside Facebook. It
mm,
grew companies like Zynga most famously. And then when Zynga suddenly became too big, Facebook was like, oh, we don't think that's a good idea. And then they changed the rules overnight, as you would in a country that has a dictator, if it doesn't suit their own terms. And they basically did that. And we ourselves experienced that. Our apps got deplatformed. We were one of the biggest mobile game companies on the App Store in Apple
oh,
by 2012, and they removed all of our apps. And we never got an official reason why. But the headlines at the time were like, oh, we were sort of gaming the App Store and all that kind of stuff. But we never knew. There was no appeals process. There was nobody
oh,
we could talk to. There was nothing. And the most insidious thing about sort of getting deplatformed is the censorship. Not the censorship that happens because a third party does it, but because you do it yourself. You're basically starting
oh,
to limit your own freedom because you say, well, I shouldn't say anything because if I do, I might never get on the App Store. If I can never get on the App Store, actually that could be worse, right? And it's
mm,
it's that type of sort of sense of sort of assault on your freedom and your liberties that sort of makes you start to think about what happened to this world. So anyway, so we are where we are right now, and sort of what happened was is that the combination of those personal experiences and seeing the potential of NFTs essentially made us realize that Web3 will build the internet the way that it could have or should have in Web 1 because now the intermediary is the blockchain. So the
oh,
blockchain itself becomes the mechanism in which we transact. And yes, there can be platforms like marketplaces that facilitate it, but they're not exclusive. Meaning that, if I wanted to launch an app on the App Store, I don't lose my customers if I leave the App Store. See, that's the
mm,
issue, right? When I go away from any of these platforms, who owns your customer? Who owns your followers on Instagram? Who owns everything, right? And so the irony of this is that them providing these services, actually, they've colonized us. They've digitally colonized us. in the most egregious way, creating and taking all of the value and giving us nothing back in return. And it's probably the most anti-competitive practice out there. And it's ironic that sometimes it's described as, well, it's capitalism on overdrive, when in fact probably their business practices are about as anti-capitalist as you can think. And I think unfortunately regulators have just started to cotton on to this issue, but it's kind of like too little, too late. And so I think the antidote isn't regulation, because I think that's going to step people back even further, but instead I think it's new technological innovations like Web3.
So just the last question that I have yet, what do you think it will take for Web3 to be a mainstream consumer product, just be something that people use on an everyday basis? And what do you want to accomplish in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, one of the things that we've noticed that when you onboard people from Web2 to Web3, the challenge is not a technology challenge. As in, sure, it's unfamiliar to open up a MetaMask wallet and to be on chain and so on. But just think about how hard it is to get even to online. We don't think of it as hard, but buying a mobile phone and getting internet, getting connected, or switching your cell phone, your smartphone, it's actually a pretty lengthy process. You have to go to a service provider, you have to fill out some forms, physical forms, right? You have to do all sorts of stuff that actually takes you hours, right? And you open up, what last time you tried to open a bank account? It wasn't like you just go in and just say, hey, you have to show your passport. Even if it's online, you have to go through KYC, AML. None of these processes are simple and fluid and easy, but they're socially accepted, meaning that within the circle around, it's actually really like, oh, I don't know how to do this. Well, there's 100 other people in your social circle that can help you. Okay, great. So you don't necessarily need a help desk. You ask your friends and so on, again, because it's socially accepted. So we accepted that these things take time and they're a norm, and somehow they become easy or simple or user-friendly. When you objectively think about it, it's nothing user-friendly about it. I would argue that opening up a crypto wallet, for instance, to enter Web3 is far easier, far more, even intuitive in a natural sense than opening a bank account or going to, your local telco provider to get a cell phone, to get a smartphone. So you can actually go online, right? Like stuff like that is actually, sort of non-obvious but when you step out and sort of take sort of bird's eye view, you go, wait, sometimes it's always good to take the perspective of if an alien came to planet Earth and looked at our processes and said, what makes sense, right? And in this case, obviously, actually, some of those things that we do that are supposed to be common sense actually don't make sense whatsoever, right? And the point I'm trying to illustrate is that it's not a technology challenge, because we've solved access, for instance. We've solved sort of, screens and computers. It's not VR and AR that's bringing us online, right? Or make it better. The screens and the things that we're doing right now are sufficient. So we've discovered, at least in our sort of anecdotal sort of perspective, that it's a paradigm shift about financial literacy and value. So in other words, and similarly to the early days of any kind of adoption, what's important is why you do it, not how or what you do, right? So if I basically understand that Web3 is a way in which I can own my digital assets for the first time and understand what ownership is, that there's a property right that is the same as your physical property rights in terms of its value formation and capital formation, then you start going, oh, okay, that's interesting. But most people don't even know how their physical property rights work, right? I mean, I often run into arguments around sort of, why digital property rights is important. This is, well, it's not bricks and mortars. And then I ask the question, so you think you own your house because it's made of bricks? And, it takes a while for people to sometimes understand that it's not the physicality that actually makes it real in terms of your ownership. It's your government. And what is your government? Your government is maybe elected, or maybe it's a dictatorship, depending where you are, and they control the ownership. And what is the story they told you that you are insured of this ownership? In a sense, it is fiction, right? I mean, even the democratic institution is a form of fiction that we commonly agree on, and there's a mechanism to protect that. But there's a reason why a democracy, a sort of a more true democracy, which is decentralized, has higher value formation, because you know that you can change it. So the inflexibility of making change actually is a security in the system. If America was run by a dictator who could change anything anytime they wanted, even if that person was benevolent, its value and capital formation would be significantly lower. And we know countries that have that kind of setup where there is a discount to their earnings potential because their rules can change anytime, right? So it's the same thing. And so we have this in the digital world where Apple can change the rules anytime. Facebook can
Mm,
change the rules anytime, which, by the way, they have done like literally every few months when something suits them, because there's no parliamentary process, there's no discussion with the community. It's more like some people literally in their ivory tower go, well, we think this is good, and by the way, it suits us more, so push the button. So that's kind of why sort of all of this is so important. But to get people to understand why you have to go to Web3, you have to understand kind of what I just described, right? Which is not the easiest part, because you take it for granted. Because in many ways, those aspects of our life have been outsourced. So
mm,
the people who understand freedom and liberties and what gives it to us is actually one of the reasons why there's such a rallying call for people in crypto and in blockchain, right? They're like, why do you care about this? Well, it's about my freedom, and it's about property rights, and it's about essentially my liberties. Some of them obviously are going much more in the sort of anarchic side of things, right? Like sort of screw government. We're not like that at all. We do think government is very important, but there's perspectives, right? Does government, so who does government serve? And if government serves the people, then in a way they are your proxy anyway, right? So I think that's essentially, I guess, the American Constitution and the setup of a number of countries around the world. So again, it's within that framework. But again, how many people really understand that? Like I often sort of ponder around the fact that why is it that in places where you can sort of choose to vote as opposed to are forced to vote, that there's barely a 50% turnover,
mm,
that a turn up when it comes to people voting, and that's partially because I think people don't understand or appreciate democracy or what it stands for instance, right? And that in some ways it's almost like a civic duty. So it's these things that have to be brought on. And when you think about the early days of the internet, when we basically were logging onto sort of a dial-up sort of internet, and we were browsing on Mosaic and then eventually Netscape, there was nothing beautiful about it. And really, if you had compared it to a magazine or something physical, it was clearly inferior to the physical experience. And in some ways, that's what we're seeing today. When I go from Web 2 to Web 3, it is an inferior experience because the games aren't quite as good yet. The websites kind of look the same. The content is built on the same rails. But
mhm,
fundamentally, what's underneath it is what's valuable. And that's the same with what happened in Web 1. It wasn't the fact that it looked better or felt better. It was the fact that you wanted to have freedom and access to information, democratic access to information that used to be siloed, that you could only access from books and magazines, that your thoughts and my opinions were not heard because you didn't have something like the internet, and you couldn't have that kind of sort of proliferation of information that you could have with the internet, even though it looked ugly or didn't feel that way, because we weren't accustomed to the fact that we could suddenly receive information from someone far away in Africa or in Asia that had an opinion that actually might matter to you, right? And the same is now true for Web3, but it's now happened in terms of sort of value and essentially financial systems, because also on blockchain, all transactions happen on the same layer. In the early days of the internet, the current form of the internet, you have different layers. PayPal is a layer, financial systems is a layer that doesn't actually operate on the same transactional system as the one that you might be playing the game with, or the one that you're sort of trading on Amazon or whatever, or buying something or whatever. They're different rails that then have to be glued together in a pretty clumsy way to operate. And on blockchain, it all happens on the same chain, which is more efficient. The security is embedded. It also makes it simpler, meaning that if you're a developer, you can actually develop on a system that has all of it, as opposed to basically, with the security embedded in it, as opposed to needing multiple experts to put it together. So all these factors actually make Web3 accelerate, and the end user needs to understand that paradigm. And with that comes a form of financial literacy. So the big thing we think that will actually onboard people more on the sort of why is financial literacy. The more financially literate we make people, the more they'll understand why Web3 is important. Sometimes Web3 is described as the internet of value,
mm,
or blockchain, being, able to be a store of value. And I think there's a reason behind that, because the financial aspect is deeply embedded. And if you understand more about how money works, if you understand more about how value works and how your property rights works, then actually you will absolutely demand that from the digital context, and Web3 is the only way. So that's kind of, I think, what needs to happen. We saw this in early forms of Web3 games, which is what we were very focused on, like with Axie Infinity, for instance, in the Philippines. And also we did this with Open Campus, basically to try to help push Web3 education broadly as well. for all the reasons I mentioned. So we think it's essentially more of a sort of a mental mind shift, a sort of adoption sort of challenge, which we can do with storytelling and gaming and so on, rather than necessarily here's better tools. I mean, tools will always improve, but that's not the reason you move from one place to the other.
Well, yeah, I think that's all the questions that I had. I think you definitely have the right approach in terms of being able to get mass adoption and making people understand this and showing really what the value is with Web3. And you've helped so many people get started in this space and build great companies. So I'm excited to see what you continue to do and wish you much success.
Thank you so much.